Hey everyone, quick look at this. See that? Almost 98% of you watching aren't subscribed yet. Subscribing is the best way to not miss any new infidelity stories and support what we do here. It's free and it makes a huge difference. Hit that subscribe button below. Okay, now to today's story.
Okay, I gotta get this off my chest. It's been eating at me, something fierce, like a bad case of heartburn that just won't quit. You know how it is when you do something you ain't proud of? Something that makes you look in the mirror and kinda cringe? Yeah, well, this is one of them stories. Happened a while back now, but the shame still sticks to me like cheap perfume on a hot day. I was working at the diner then, the one down on Main Street, Rosie's. Been there for, Lord, must have been close to 15 years. Seen a lot of faces come and go, a lot of spilled coffee and broken dreams. Thought I'd seen it all, to be honest. But then Wade showed up. Wade? He was just a kid, really. Fresh out of high school, all gangly arms and a shy smile that could melt butter. He started as a busboy, clearing tables and running dishes. Seemed like a nice enough boy, quiet, kept to himself mostly. I didn't pay him much mind at first, just another young face in the crowd. I was busy enough with my own stuff, the bills, the aches and pains that come with standing on your feet all day. My kids were grown and gone, living their own lives. It was just me and the TV most nights. Work was just work. A way to pay the rent and keep the lights on. I hadn't really felt, anything much in a long time, if you catch my drift. Romance? That felt like something from a whole other lifetime. But then there was this one day. It was a Tuesday, I think. We were short-staffed, swamped with the lunchtime rush. People were coming in thick and fast, orders flying every which way. I was running around like a chicken with its head cut off, trying to keep up. My uniform was sticking to me, all sweaty and gross. Finally, things started to slow, down a bit after the rush. I went to the back, to the little change-in room we had. It wasn't much, just a cramped space with a couple of lockers and a curtain you could pull for privacy. Usually, nobody else was back there at that time. The fellas had their own tiny room on the other side of the kitchen. I was just getting my shirt off, ready to put on a clean one, when the curtain kinda twitched. And then I saw him. Wade. He froze like a deer in headlights, his eyes wide as saucers. He mumbled something like, "Oh, sorry, Christina," and backed out of there faster than a scalded dog. But in that split second, I know he saw me, saw more than he should have. My face went red hot, and my heart started pounding in my chest. I felt exposed, embarrassed, and something else too. Something I hadn't felt in years. A jolt. A spark. It was unsettling, to say the least. I finished changing as fast as I could, my hands shaking a little. When I went back out to the floor, Wade was nowhere to be seen. I tried to act like nothing happened, just kept taking orders and pouring coffee. But I couldn't shake the image of his surprised face, or the strange feeling that had stirred inside me. It was like something that had been sleeping, for a long time had suddenly woken up, and it was looking right at Wade. After that day, things felt different. Awkward, mostly. Wade would avoid eye contact with me, always looking down or away when we were near each other. I tried to act normal, like it was no big deal, just a silly accident. But the truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about it, and about him. I started noticing things I hadn't before. The way his brow furrowed when he was concentrating on carrying a tray full of dishes. The little dimple that would appear on his cheek when he smiled. The way he always offered to help the older folks with their coats. He was a sweet kid, I had to admit. Maybe a little clumsy, always bumping into things, but sweet. And then there was this pull. This weird attraction that just wouldn't go away. It was crazy, I knew it. He was practically still wet behind the ears, and I was old, enough to be his mother. Probably even his grandmother, if I thought about it too hard. It wasn't right. It wasn't professional. We worked together, for Pete's sake. But my heart didn't seem to care about any of that. It just kept thumping a little faster whenever he was around. It was like being 16 again, all those silly crushes and butterflies in your stomach. Except this time, it felt dangerous. Like I was playing with fire. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself it was just a silly infatuation, something that would pass. I focused on my work, on the customers, on anything but Wade. But it was hard. We were always bumping into each other in the small space of the diner. He'd ask me questions about orders or where something was kept. Sometimes our hands would brush when we were reaching for the same thing, and that little spark would be there again. It was enough to make my cheeks flush and my breath catch in my throat. I started finding excuses to talk to him. Ask him about his day or how school was. He was taking some community college classes at night. Seemed like a good kid, trying to make something of himself. He'd tell me about his classes, his friends, his dreams of maybe one day opening his own restaurant. And I'd listen. Really listen. It felt good to talk to someone young, someone with all that hope and energy. It made me feel less old, somehow. Less worn down by life. The other waitresses, Betty and Marlene, they'd tease me sometimes, saying I had a soft spot for the new kid. I'd just laugh it off, tell them they were imagining things. But inside, I knew they were probably right. I did have a soft spot for Wade. Maybe more than just a soft spot. It was like this little seed had been planted that day in the change-in room, and it was starting to grow roots. Roots that were tangled and messy and probably leading nowhere good. But I couldn't seem to stop it. I was caught in this weird little bubble of longing and guilt, and I didn't know how to get out. Work became this weird tightrope walk. One minute I'd be trying to act like his boss, telling him to wipe down a table or refill the sugar dispensers. The next, I'd be catching his eye across the room and feeling this flutter in my chest. It was like I was living two different lives at once. There was the Christina everyone else saw, the seasoned waitress, the one who knew all the regulars and could handle any situation with a smile. And then there was the other Christina, the one who couldn't stop thinking about Wade's smile, the one who felt this crazy, inappropriate pull towards him. I started getting anxious all the time, worrying about what the others would think if they knew how I felt. Worrying about what Wade thought? Did he even like me? Or was he just being polite because I was older and worked there longer? The thought of him not feeling the same way, it stung more than I cared to admit. But then there were these little moments, these little glances or smiles that made me wonder. Maybe there was something there. Or maybe I was just seeing what I wanted to see. I started staying later after my shift, just to chat with him while he finished up his cleaning. We'd talk about all sorts of things, movies, music, even politics sometimes. He had some surprisingly strong opinions for such a young fella, and he listened to me too, really listened. Like what I had to say actually mattered. It was nice. It was too nice. It was making it harder to keep that professional distance. One slow evening, after all the customers had gone home, it was just me and Wade cleaning up. Betty and Marlene had already left. The diner felt quiet and empty, the only sound the clinking of dishes from the kitchen. Wade was wiping down the counter near the cash register, and I was stacking chairs on the tables. We were both just kind of working in silence, but it wasn't an awkward silence. It felt comfortable. Then he turned to me and said, "Hey, Christina, you ever think about leaving Rosie's?" I stopped what I was doing and looked at him. "Sometimes," I said. "When my feet are killing me and I've had one too many rude customers." "Why?" He shrugged. "Just wondering. Seems like you could do something else, you know? You're really good with people." That little compliment coming from him, it made me feel all warm and fuzzy inside. I smiled at him. "Thanks. Wade?" He smiled back, that shy smile with the dimple. And then, I don't know what came over me. It was like something just snapped. I walked over to him, and before I even knew what I was doing, I leaned in and kissed him. Right there, in the empty diner, under the fluorescent lights. The second my lips touched his, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. It was like a switch flipped in my brain, and all the guilt and shame came flooding back. He was surprised. I could feel it. His lips were soft, and he didn't pull away. Right away, but then he did. His eyes were wide with shock, and maybe a little bit of something else? Confusion? Disgust? I couldn't tell. I pulled back, my face burning like I'd stuck it in a fryer. "Oh God, Wade, I'm so sorry," I stammered, my voice shaken. I don't know what I was thinking." He just stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he looked down at the counter, his cheeks flushed. It's okay, Christina," he mumbled. But he didn't sound like it was okay. Not at all. The silence that followed was thick and heavy, like you could cut it with a knife. I wanted to disappear, to crawl under a rock and hide. I felt like the biggest fool in the world. What had I done? I'd crossed a line, a big one. I'd betrayed his trust, and probably my own too. I should go," I said finally, grabbing my purse and coat. I couldn't meet his eyes. "I'll see you tomorrow." He just nodded, still looking down. I practically ran out of the diner, the cool night air doing little to cool my burning face. I felt sick to my stomach. What had I been thinking? He was just a kid, and I was his boss practically. It was so wrong, so incredibly wrong. I didn't sleep much that night. I just lay in bed, replaying the scene over and over in my head. The look on his face. My own stupid impulsiveness. The shame was overwhelming. I kept thinking about what the others would say if they found out. Betty and Marlene would have a field day. And Rosie would probably fire me on the spot. I deserved it. The next day at work was even more awkward than I could have imagined. Wade kept his distance, avoiding me whenever possible. When we did have to talk, it was short and to the point. No smiles, no lingering glances. It was like the kiss had built this huge wall between us. The other waitresses noticed something was up. "You two seem a little quiet today," Betty said with a sly look. "Everything all right?" I just forced a smile and said, "Yeah, just a long night." I didn't dare look at Wade. It was awful. The fun had gone out of work. The little moments of connection I thought we had. They all felt tainted now. I'd messed things up, big time, and I didn't know how to fix it. I felt a deep sense of guilt, not just towards Wade, but towards everyone. I'd jeopardized the whole team dynamic with my stupid, selfish actions. Things went on like that for a few weeks. The tension between Wade and me was still there, hanging in the air like a bad smell. He was polite but distant, and I felt like I had to walk on eggshells whenever he was around. I knew I couldn't let it go on like that. I had to do something. One afternoon, after the lunch rush, I caught Wade wiping down tables in a quiet corner of the diner. I took a deep breath and walked over to him. "Wade, can we talk for a minute?" He looked up, his expression wary. "Sure, Christina." We stepped outside, onto the sidewalk in front of the diner. The sun was shining, but I felt a cold knot of anxiety in my stomach. "Look, Wade," I started, my voice a little shaky. "I know what I did was wrong. That kiss, it shouldn't have happened. I'm really sorry. I wasn't thinking." He looked down at his shoes. "It's okay," he said quietly. "Just don't do it again." "I won't," I promised. "I swear. It was a mistake. A big one. And I understand if you're upset or uncomfortable." He finally looked up at me, and I saw a flicker of sadness in his eyes. "It's just, I liked working here," he said. And now, it feels different. I nodded, feeling a fresh wave of guilt wash over me. I know, and I'm so sorry for that. I never meant to make you feel uncomfortable, or to mess things up for you. We stood there in silence for a moment, the sounds of traffic rushing past us. Then, Wade sighed. Maybe it's better if I find another job, he said softly. My heart sank. Oh, Wade, you don't have to do that. He shrugged. I think it's for the best, Christina, for both of us. I knew he was right. As much as it hurt to hear, I knew he was right. I'd made things too awkward, too complicated. He deserved to work in a place where he felt comfortable, where he didn't have to worry about his older coworker trying to kiss him. Okay, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Okay, I understand. He looked a little surprised. You do? I nodded. Yeah, you're right. It's for the best. He gave me a small, sad smile. Thanks, Christina. No, I said. Thank you, Wade, for being understanding. And for everything. He nodded again, then turned and walked away, down the sidewalk and out of sight. I watched him go, a heavy weight in my chest. I knew I'd probably never see him again, and it was my fault. I'd let my stupid feelings get the better of me, and I'd ended up hurting someone I didn't mean to. It was a harsh lesson, one I wouldn't soon forget. And the shame. Well, the shame would probably stick with me for a long time to come. But maybe, just maybe, by telling this story, by confessing what I did, I could finally start to let go of some of that guilt. Maybe. The days kind of blurred into weeks after Wade left. I'd catch myself looking over at the tables he used to clear, or listening for his slightly off-key humming when he was loading the dishwasher. It was silly, I knew. He was just a kid, and I'd known him for such a short time. But he'd, stirred something in me that had been dormant for years, and now that something was just kinda aching. One afternoon, the kind of slow day where you could hear the clock ticking, and the flies buzzing near the window, the bell above the door jingled. A young fella came in, looking a bit damp from the drizzle outside. He was wearing a college sweatshirt and had a backpack slung over his shoulder. Something about him looked a little familiar, but I couldn't quite place it. He sat down at the counter and ordered a coffee and a slice of apple pie. I poured him the coffee, the smell of it filling the air, and went to get him a piece of pie. As I set it down in front of him, he looked up at me and smiled. You're Christina, right? He asked. I nodded, a little surprised. Yeah, that's me. You a regular? He chuckled. Nah, not really. But Wade used to talk about you. My heart did a little flutter kick in my chest. Wade. It had been weeks since I'd heard his name out loud. He did? I asked, trying to sound casual as I wiped down the counter. The young fella took a bite of his pie. Yeah, he said. You were always really nice to him. Helped him out when he was learning the ropes and stuff. He paused, chewing thoughtfully. He misses working here. Found another job at a warehouse, but he says it ain't the same. Not as lively, I guess. A little wave of relief washed over me. He didn't sound angry or bitter, just matter of fact. Oh, I said. Well, I'm glad he found something. He nodded. Yeah, he's still going to classes at the community college, studying. Something to do with business, I think. He's got big plans, that kid. He smiled again, a friendly, open smile. Wants to open his restaurant someday, you know? I remembered Wade telling me that, his eyes all lit up with excitement. It felt good to hear he was still chasing that dream. That's great, I said, and I meant it. The young fella finished his pie and took a long sip of his coffee. Then he kind of hesitated for a second, like he was thinking about something. He also said, he started, then looked down at his empty plate for a moment before looking back up at me. He said he understood about what happened. My breath caught in my throat. Understood? I hadn't expected that. I'd been so caught up in my shame and regret, I hadn't even considered how Wade might have felt. I'd just assumed he was probably disgusted or angry. He did? I managed to say, my voice a little shaky. The young man nodded. Yeah, he didn't go into details or nothing, but he just said he understood. Said it was a mistake, and that he didn't want it to mess things up for you too much. A wave of emotions washed over me. Relief, definitely, but also a fresh pang of sadness and a whole lot of confusion. Understood? How could he understand? I still barely understood it myself. But just hearing those words, coming from someone who'd talked to him, it was like a little weight had been lifted off my shoulders. Not all of it, mind you, but enough to make it a little easier to breathe. The young fella reached into his backpack and pulled out his wallet. He paid for his coffee and pie, then stood up to leave. He's doing okay, though, he said as he slung his backpack back on. Still kinda quiet, but he's getting on with things. Maybe someday he'll open that restaurant he was always talking about. He got to the door, then turned back and looked at me one last time. Oh yeah, he said, almost as an afterthought. He told me to tell you. He hopes you're doing okay too. And with that, he smiled again and headed out into the drizzle. I stood there behind the counter for a long moment, just staring out at the rain. Wade hoped I was doing okay. It was such a simple thing to say, but it hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't the angry reaction I'd braced myself for. It wasn't even really forgiveness, not exactly. It was more like an acknowledgement. A small piece of closure in a situation that had felt so messy and unresolved. I didn't know his friend's name, didn't even think to ask. He was just this unexpected messenger, a link back to Wade, and a reminder that even in the middle of a big mistake, there can sometimes be a little bit of understanding. It didn't erase the shame, and it didn't change what happened. But it did offer a tiny crack of light in the heavy cloud of my regret. The uncertainty still lingered, the what-ifs and the could-have-beens. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a tiny sliver of peace. Maybe, just maybe, I would be okay. And maybe, just maybe, Wade would too. Time does this funny thing, you know. It can feel like it's crawling by when you're waiting for something good, and then it just up and flies when you ain't paying attention. It had been a good few months since Wade's friend. What was his name again? Mark, maybe? Yeah, I think it was Mark. Anyway, since Mark had come into the diner, things had settled back into a kind of normal routine for me at Rosie's. I still thought about Wade sometimes, especially when I was cleaning up late at night and the diner was quiet. But the sharp pang of guilt had dulled into more of a quiet ache, a reminder of a lesson learned. I was trying to be more mindful of how I acted around the younger folks at work, keeping things strictly professional. Betty and Marlene still had their moments of gossip, but even that seemed to have faded a bit around the topic of me and Wade. One Saturday morning, the diner was packed. The weekend breakfast crowd was in full swing, folks enjoying their pancakes and coffee, the air thick with the smell of bacon. I was running back and forth, my tray loaded with plates, calling out orders to Rosie in the kitchen. It was one of those chaotic mornings where you just had to keep your head down and keep moving. I'd just delivered a stack of waffles to a table by the window and was heading back to the counter for more coffee when I saw him. He was standing near the entrance, looking a little taller than I remembered, maybe a bit broader in the shoulders. He was wearing jeans and a plain t-shirt, and he had a backpack slung over one shoulder. For a split second, my heart did that flutter kick thing again. It was Wade. He was looking around like he was waiting for someone. He hadn't seen me yet. I took a deep breath and tried to act natural, grabbing the coffee pot and heading towards the counter. But my eyes kept drifting back to him. What was he doing here? Had he come back to the diner? Just as I was about to reach the counter, our eyes met. His face lit up a little when he saw me, a genuine, friendly smile. Not the shy, hesitant one I remembered. but a more confident one. I smiled back, a little surprised, but also relieved. He walked over to the counter. "Hey, Christina," he said, his voice a little deeper than I remembered too. "Wade," I replied, putting down the coffee pot. "Hi. What are you doing here?" "Oh, I was just in the neighborhood," he said, shrugging a little. "Thought I'd stop by and see how things were going." He glanced around the busy diner. "Looks like you guys are still swamped." I chuckled. "Always on a Saturday morning? You waiting for someone?" "Yeah, a friend. We're gonna grab some breakfast." He paused for a moment, then looked at me, his expression a little more serious. "How have you been?" "I've been okay," I said. "Busy? You?" "Yeah, good. Warehouse jobs. Well, it's a warehouse job. But the classes are going good." He smiled again. "Still dreaming of that restaurant." "I'm glad to hear it," I said, and I truly was. He seemed good, like he'd moved on, found his footing. There was a brief silence, a comfortable one this time, not awkward like it used to be after, well, you know. Then Wade shifted his weight. "Look, Christina," he said, his voice a little softer. "I just wanted to say thanks for everything, for being nice when I first started, and yeah, what happened? It's okay. I get it. We all make mistakes." His words hit me right in the chest. "Wade," I started, my voice a little choked up. "I'm so sorry about that. I am. It wasn't right of me." He just shook his head gently. "It's in the past. No worries. Just wanted you to know." He smiled that more confident smile again. "Gotta go. My friend just got here." He gestured towards a young woman who had just walked in the door. "Okay," I said, returning his smile. "It was good to see you, Wade." "You too, Christina." He turned and walked over to his friend, and I watched them find a table. They were laughing and talking, just two young people enjoying their Saturday morning. I went back to pouring coffee, my hands a little steadier than they had been a few minutes ago. That brief conversation with Wade. It was like a little weight had been lifted. He wasn't angry. He understood, or at least he said he did. And he seemed to be doing well. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation, no tearful apologies or promises of friendship. It was just a quiet moment of understanding, a simple acknowledgement of what had happened and a silent agreement to move on. As I served another table of hungry customers, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The shame was still there, a faint shadow in the back of my mind, but it didn't feel so heavy anymore. I'd made a mistake, a big one. But we all do. And sometimes, the best you can hope for is a little bit of understanding and the chance to move forward and try to do better next time. And that, I realized, was exactly what had happened. Thanks for watching. If you are enjoying our content, subscribe. New infidelity stories every day.